Okay, our first reading will be Atrahasis, which is also called When the Gods Like Men, or When the Gods Instead of Men. Uh, it's given that title in its original. When I say its original, I mean the tablets you see in the background. The ancient cuneiform tablets that this is derived from, they didn't have names like titles. They titled their work by the first line. And the first line of Atrahasis, as you're going to see in Stephanie Dalley's translation, it's when the gods instead of men. That's just a fragment of a sentence. It'll make more sense when you read it. But it's going to be referred to at the end of the text by that title, just that line, when the gods like men. This text and the tablets that most of it come from are dated to between the years 1900 and 1700 BCE, before the Common Era, or just BC. So this is about the beginning of narrative literature. Just a reminder where it comes from. This is modern-day Iraq, and we're going to refer to it as Mesopotamia because it's not specifically Iraq. Although, by the way, the modern word Iraq comes from the names of one of these cities, Uruk. But it's called Mesopotamia because it's between these two very large rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. This is sometimes referred to as part of the Fertile Crescent. We're going back about 5,000 years to the when Sumeria is the first sort of major civilization in Mesopotamia. When the Sumerians invent writing. They invent a type of writing called cuneiform. Now, about the same time, hieroglyphics were being developed in Egypt, but these are not completely separate cultures, as you can see from the map. The Fertile Crescent sort of connects the edge of Egypt with the Mesopotamian River Valley, and we're going to be looking at the interchange between that cultures up and down that path. But about the same time the Greeks are developing hieroglyphics, the Sumerians are developing cuneiform. And the earliest cuneiform writings are developing around 3100 BC. We have urban development happening in this area before it happens anywhere else, pretty much anywhere else in the world. We have large villages and village complexes, but nothing like the urbanization we see happening in Mesopotamia. Just for some perspective, this is still about 1,000 years or 2,000 years before the Trojan War. Same amount of time almost since the writing of the Bible, before the compilation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Long before all of these cultures become what we know them as being, before ancient Greece and ancient Israel become the cultures we're vaguely familiar with, the Sumerians have already created a major sort of world culture. Now, I mentioned that it was the first urban culture. The city of Ur, which is close to the mouth of the Euphrates River, would be the largest city in the world for 2,000 years, up until the rise of Rome. Before that, there was no city in the world that was this big, and no city that we would really recognize as a city, like as a large metropolitan area, the way that Ur was. The name Mesopotamia means land between the rivers. I may have mentioned already. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and if you look at this sort of this drawing of the landmass, you see the Zagros Mountains in the north, you see the deserts to the west and to the south. But in that middle portion, you're in a really dry area, but it's also a watershed area. So it's surrounded by really dry areas, but all of the rain that falls, as rare as it is for it to fall, whenever it falls in those areas, it all washes down through Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia has a pretty steady supply of water. And that water makes it what it is. It enables the agriculture. It enables transportation over further distances than most people are able to travel. And it also, the clay that the earth is mostly composed of in that area, forms the building material. So wet clay that dries, there's not enough, as you can tell from this picture, this reconstruction, there are not a lot of forests around. In fact, as you'll see when we get to the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have to go a long way to find trees that are large enough to build anything out of. So the only thing you have to build with is clay. But they build really well with it, very well with it. But they also build out of reeds. They can build buildings out of reeds, and reeds are these, really tall grasses that grow in swampy areas. Here in Corpus Christi, we have a lot of these sorts of things because our geography is not that different than the Mesopotamia. But imagine if we didn't have any of the trees, even as small as our trees are. All we had were these reeds. You can bind these reeds together and build relatively strong buildings. The buildings that in some places are still built, and also the boats that are still built out of these reeds, which I'll discuss in a second, these have been built the same way for all of this time, for 4, maybe 5,000 years. And there were communities living in Mesopotamia pretty much very close to the way they'd been living for thousands of years, up until the 1980s and 90s when Saddam Hussein sort of drained the swamp, literally, drained out some of these areas of the Mesopotamian river basin that where these people had been living. So killed off the leaves, they had to move, killed off the reeds, they had to relocate. But until that, we still had people building reed boats, like the guy you see on the left, as well as building these reed houses. The way you see a picture of one, a modern one on the right, but in that top center picture, you see a carving of one from a tablet that is more than 3,000 years old. We also see depictions in the art from thousands of years ago of boats very similar to the ones that were still being built up until the late 20th century. And most importantly, the reason we're talking about this culture is because this culture is the first one to produce writing, like I said. And the writing they produce isn't exactly what we might expect. It's not taking some sort of ink and then writing on a piece of paper. It's not on parchment. It's not on, not even on papyrus, even though papyrus will be developed shortly hereafter. It's written on clay tablets. Like I said, they built everything out of clay because they didn't have the trees for it. They also used that instead of papyrus for writing, and it's a good thing they did, because ancient papyrus that was written thousands of years ago, for the most part, has completely decomposed. Every now and then we'll find something from 2,000 years ago, maybe 2,500 years ago. I'm not sure what the oldest papyrus is, but it's not nearly as old as these tablets. And these tablets survived because even when the libraries that they were stored in burned to the ground, when an invading army would invade, they would destroy all the temples, destroy the libraries, destroy the palaces, set everything on fire. But when you have a clay tablet set on fire, all that really does is solidify it. It makes it even stronger. The thing is, then the building collapses onto those tablets, so it shatters them into fragments. So you still have a lot of writing that's visible. It doesn't burn, but it tends to be broken up, the way you see here. And we have a lot of tablets coming from libraries like the kind I just described, kind that they get compiled. There are thousands of years of scribes who are there recording oral traditions, stories they've heard, mostly recording things like financial records. In fact, long before we have any kind of narrative text, we have records of financial transactions. Somebody from Egypt or from Syria wants to trade with somebody from Mesopotamia, and they send merchants to carry these livestock or something like that. Well, they have to get something back. They have to have something to show that I sent this merchant with 20 sheep to trade to this person for some silk or gold or whatever. I don't want that person taking my 20 sheep to show up with 15 sheep and say, that's all that he gave me. I want to have some way to send a message to that other destination that I won't be going to, so that person knows that I actually did send 20 sheep. So this is what most of these texts are being used for, but of course it doesn't take long before people start to use them to write down other things, record stories that people, for the most part, assume that all you have to do is tell. Just like you may not read that much because you spend more of your time watching television or watching movies or on the internet, but you tend to sort of think, well, that's where I get my entertainment for the most part. Narratives were the same way. Most of the time you would hear somebody tell a story, you wouldn't think, oh, somebody should write this down. But luckily for us, somebody did. So it developed, I compared it earlier with hieroglyphics, which we tend to think of as being pictures. Well, cuneiform started out as pictures as well. Each of these cuneiform texts, or cuneiform letters or words, is arranged in columns. So the first column is a picture of an ox at the top in the blue. And then below that is the cuneiform representation that it would later take on. So if you wanted to carve into wet clay a picture of an ox, you could draw. You could sort of drag your stylus across and make these marks that you see in the top. But that takes a long time. So if you're writing out something along, that's going to take a long time to drag your stylus through this. So instead, people start to just push the stylus in and make these wedge shapes that, you can see in the second row. That ox has now started to look like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 impressions done with this flat stylus. And the tip of the stylus looks not like the tip of a pencil, but the tip of a flathead screwdriver. So imagine taking a wet piece of clay, pushing it with a flathead screwdriver. The thing on top is going to be a lot more difficult to make than the thing just below it, as long as you know that second thing is an ox. Well, as that gets developed and you try to start writing faster, and it changes over time, the word doesn't just mean ox by itself. It now means goot, and I'm maybe mispronouncing this, but that syllable is more important than the image of the animal, of the ox. Same thing happens with a bird. You can kind of see that it looks like a bird in the second column, but by the time 600 years passed and you're working with these styluses, these flathead screwdrivers, it starts to look like something very different. And if you look at water, the wavy lines at the top make a lot of sense, but the thing it becomes by 650 BC doesn't look like anything I'd associate with water. And the one for head, I don't even know. But you can see how it starts as an image. It then takes on a phonetic value. It doesn't really matter what object it refers to. It matters more what the pronunciation is. And we combine those to make words, to make names, to make that sort of thing. And here are some of the tablets that the story of Atrahasis is written on, with the narrative of Atrahasis. These come from between 1900 and 1700 or 1600 BCE. We have pieces of them that you can tell by the cuneiform on each one, they weren't written by the same person. These were written at different times by different people, but we can tell that they're writing the same narrative of the same story. There are going to be other versions of this Atrahasis story, obviously, that once you get into it, you'll see what I'm talking about, and we'll talk more about that after you've read it. But right now, I'll just say that you'll see several different, in the text that we're going to read, you're going to see several different notations that won't make much sense if you're expecting to read a novel. But the reason they're there is because we're starting with text like this, we're starting with manuscripts like this, broken clay tablets with cuneiform on them like this, that were written by different hands at different times, but are trying to tell what seems to be the same story, probably something from oral tradition, a story that maybe not exactly word for word, but pretty close to word for word, as close as that scribe can get. Now, if a modern reader wants to figure out what's on these tablets, it goes through several processes. So two cuneiform experts, W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard, went through all of these Atrahasis tablets and transcribed them from the cuneiform into the phonetic pronunciation of those words. So they took those, what had eventually become phonetic letters, and translated them into the words that they pronounced in the Roman letters that we use today. And then they also offer a translation. But you'll notice the brackets and then the ellipses, the periods between those brackets, those indicate that you can't really tell. You can tell this word starts off as being this, but it might be one thing, it might be another. Well, this is actually the text that your translator, Stephanie Dolly, uses. She uses the column on the left. She doesn't use exactly their English translation on the right, but she uses their column on the left when she writes the book, or compiles the book, Myths from Mesopotamia. And the steps that she goes through, and she also combines tablets from other sources besides the Lambert and Millard Atrahasis account. But each time it goes through one of these translations, the translator has to make a decision. This word is probably this, but the end is broken off, and should I go ahead and translate it as that thing I think it is, or should I leave it open? So even Lambert and Millard had to make those decisions, and then Dolly is using their text instead of going right back to the actual tablets. So she has to, she will pick up whatever decisions, editorial decisions they make, incorporate them in her translation. But then she'll also have to decide, well, would a modern English audience interpret something this way, or would they misunderstand it? So do I need to change the word? And then how do I deal with all those broken areas? Well, every time you take other sources and you translate them, or you decide, what do I keep, what do I leave out, what do I change, do I need to change the meaning a little bit so that people understand, do I need to create a coherence? Remember that term, associative coherence we used in the previous lecture. Do I take something that doesn't make sense and try to make it more coherent? Well, that's called redaction. Redaction is the process of compiling a single text from multiple texts and editing them to make the new text more coherent. And again, just a reminder, it's red letters. That's a term I want you to know later on. We'll be using that throughout the rest of the semester. Okay, so here's a page from Myths of Mesopotamia that is one of the ones you're going to read. And notice that there are these open brackets. That means in that first open bracket, there's a line that can't be read. So it's one of those where there's a crack, or there's the cuneiform has been rubbed to where it's just smooth and you can't tell what it says. So instead of trying to fill in the gaps, and this is something that if somebody was translating this for a popular press book, the kind you would expect to read like a novel, then they might decide, well, this probably means this, I'll go ahead and make this thing up. But Dolly doesn't do that. She leaves these brackets open and says, basically, we don't know what's there. But that means as a reader, you have to decide what goes there. Now, you don't actually have to decide, but you're probably going to find yourself filling in the gaps immediately. If it's something that you can go ahead and infer, you might do that. But sometimes you're not going to have any idea what goes there, and that's okay. It's okay not to know what goes in the gaps. You'll see also some brackets that do have text in there. Now, I'm going to talk about where those texts come from. If that's from a broken area, then where did she get these words? How does she know what's there if there's a break in that fragment? I'm going to leave that question open for right now. I'm going to come back to that later on. But I want you to go ahead and see if you can figure out where those words come from. When you read this in the larger context, you're going to start to maybe see, oh, I recognize those texts from somewhere else. So in the meantime, you figure out where those words within the brackets came from if there's actually a crack or a break there. You're also going to see the letters OBV and SBV in the left-hand side, left-hand margin. Don't just overlook that. Those are important. They're going to be even more important when we read the Epic of Gilgamesh. OBV stands for the Old Babylonian Version. SBV stands for Standard Babylonian Version. Those come from two different, what we call recensions. The oldest and the majority of the Atrahasis text that you're going to read comes from these tablets that were written down somewhere between 1900 and 1700 BC. But sometimes there's going to be big breaks or things you're going to be missing, and Dolly's going to use the Standard Babylonian Version to fill in. But she'll tell you over in the left-hand column that she's switching from OBV to SBV. So that's what that means. What came before, like in this example, what comes above the OBV must have been the SBV, the Standard Babylonian Version, the one that came around between 700 and 650 BC. And then when you see OBV, everything after that is going to be back to the Old Babylonian Version. And like I said, with Atrahasis, the majority of what we're going to read is from the Old Babylonian Version. So really, really ancient literature. But because there's so many breaks, because there's so many gaps, and because this is something that comes from a very, very different cultural context, I'm going to go through a quick list of characters, the dramatis personae. We have the title character of Atrahasis. He's a human. He's the only human mentioned in this entire story. He's a king of Shuruppak, we're told. You'll notice that Shuruppak, the city, is really close to the city of Uruk. It's close to the city of Babylon. It's literally right between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates River. And it's one of the oldest places where we find ancient writing. So it's possible there was a historical king named Atrahasis. But as we're going to get to later on when we talk about his parallel characters, this is probably a more of a literary figure that his name is going to have a meaning similar to names that we're going to come across later on. So the story, this narrative tells us he's the king of Shuruppak. He's a human king, and he's a devotee of the god Enki, or Ea. Now, a very important aspect of switching back and forth between the Old Babylonian version and the Standard Babylonian version is the Standard Babylonian version is written at a time when the same god is described as Ea. His name is Ea. But the old version, the older version of the god and the older version of these texts, his name is Enki. Well, Enki is a very prominent god in the Sumerian and Babylonian pantheon. These are slightly different pantheons, but they're all the Mesopotamian cultures sort of adapt each other's gods, and they change their names sometimes, or they change their stories a little bit. Usually they change who's more important. So the god Elil, we'll see later, will be replaced by a god named Marduk after Marduk's culture overtakes Elil's culture. But Enki is pretty well respected as a god and as a character in all of these cultures for a couple of thousand years. He's known both as Enki and Ea. He's the god of the fresh water, which is called the Apsu. A water god might not seem like that important a god, but remember, this is the land between the rivers. This is a land sandwiched between a desert, one of the worst deserts on earth, and dry mountains, both of which are very inhospitable. So these rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, enable not only life, but enable this, flowering urban civilization. So obviously, in this place, the god of fresh water is going to be very important. Fresh water, by the way, is distinct from the type of salt water you'd have in the Persian Gulf, even in the mythology. The salt water has its own gods, in particular the monster called Tiamat, which I may talk about later on. But fresh water is the water of life. It's sometimes referred to as sweet water in some of these translations. He's also the god of wisdom. He's a god of wisdom, and that doesn't just mean he's wise himself, but he's a helper of mankind. He sends these 7 sages to teach humans technology, art, and philosophy. He's also a trickster. He's not entirely upfront with everything, as we're going to see in Atrahasis. He's going to make a promise and then break that promise in Atrahasis, and we'll learn more about what's going on there as we move into the Epic of Gilgamesh. But all of these elements are going to be very important because this character we're going to see transform as his story gets retold across cultures. Then there's the eldest of the gods, the father of the gods, is called Anu. After him, all the elder gods are called the Anunnaki. They're the gods of an older generation. A lot of mythologies have this. There's a generation of gods a long time ago, and then they're replaced by these younger gods in Greek mythology. It was Cronus, or the Latin Saturn, who is later, he and the Titans are later replaced by the god Zeus or Jupiter. Well, Anu is later, I don't know if you'd say he retires or whatever, but Enlil, his son, who is the war god and the sky god, he later replaces Anu, although it's a peaceful transition, or maybe he just steps up to power and Anu's still in the background. Anu still tends to make a lot of decisions. But Enlil is really the most forceful, the most outspoken, the most demanding. You can tell this is somebody who thinks he ought to be in charge. He's also referred to sometimes in the text as Enlil. But he's the war god and he's a sky god. In other words, he's a storm god. So it's not just the peaceful sky, but when he comes, he brings the storms with him. And he's the chief god of the Igigi. These are the younger sky gods. They follow Enlil, but they are subordinate to the Anunnaki, the elder gods, which Enlil himself is an elder god, as is Enki and, of course, Anu. Nintu is called the womb goddess. She's referred to also as Belet Ili or Mami, and literally that's how it will be pronounced, Mami. This tends to be a common feature of all languages because when infants are just learning to talk, the M sound is one of the first ones they're able to make, and who are they making it to? Who's always the one that's closest to an infant? It's going to be the mother. So that's why mater in Latin, mutter in German, muti in Hindi. Across the world, there's these M sounds, but literally the womb goddess is named Mami. More often than in the text, she'll be referred to as Nintu or Belet Ili. She is the creator of humans, and as the womb goddess, you might think, oh, well, I know how she creates humans. Watch how she actually creates humans. This is a very important point. And remember where we are. In Mesopotamia, everything's built out of clay. The buildings are built out of clay. The tablets are built out of clay. Watch the story of the creation of human beings with that in mind. And when we talk about the world, when you read this text, a lot of things aren't going to make much sense. If you are thinking about the Earth as this sphere and, outer space, being outside of it in the sun, being stationary in the Earth, orbiting that, keep in mind how the Mesopotamians envisioned the world. The world was, of course, flat, but it wasn't, or there was a sort of round dome over it. So if you look at the sky, it looks like a dome. But there are, if the sky is a dome and the stars are up there, they must be attached to that dome. But now, where does the rain come from? Well, in the Mesopotamian conception, there was this this firmament, this sort of ceiling, basically, on the sky. And there were these vents, or these gates. You're going to see it referred to as the gates of the sky in the text of Atrahasis. And those gates could be opened, and that allowed the water that was up above that firmament. There was this big tank of water above the ceiling of the sky. And those vents could be opened, and that's where the rain came from. And you wanted that rain to be, you wanted those gates to be opened every now and then so that water would fall down into the rivers and water your crops and that sort of thing. But you didn't want too much rain because you're in this river valley, and if there's too much rain upstream, well, then you've got a flood coming. Another source of water is the water under the earth, and this is the Apsu. This is Enki's domain. And so the Mesopotamians noticed that even when it wasn't raining, there was water coming up into the river. And so there were natural springs where water would come up through even when there was a clear sky. So this is another source of fresh water, or sweet water, as the Mesopotamians described it. And then you've got the mountains on either side surrounding the world. That holds up this dome of the sky. And also you've got an underworld, and sort of, conceived of as a cave region. There's going to be, we're going to see later, that's where the souls of the dead are. And then even below that, there's the deep, which is sometimes just referred to as the waters of the deep. And this is water that you can't drink. This is not the sweet water. This is salt water or something like that. This is the realm of the goddess Tiamat, or the monster Tiamat. But importantly are the gates. The gods are imagined as having keys to the sky, the vents in the sky that let the rain down. They have keys to the spring water doors that prevent the water of the Apsu from coming up into the rivers. And they can lock those, and so there's no water, or they can open them up, and so water comes out. This is, if you're trying to imagine what they're talking about, imagine the world looking like this. Okay, so there's several questions I want you to think about as you read Atrahasis. You don't have to keep this list next to you the whole time you read it. Just read it and try to figure out what's going on, and then think about these questions, and then maybe go back and look and see if you can find the answers. And I put the page numbers there to kind of lead you to where I'm looking if you're confused. The first is, who is the main protagonist of the narrative? Now, a protagonist is the primary character in a narrative who must overcome a conflict to achieve a goal. The antagonist is a character who is the main source of conflict for that protagonist. So who is the main protagonist, and who is the main antagonist? Also think about, or try to figure out, why do the gods create humans to start with? and how do they create humans? Why does Enlil want to destroy humanity? What are the primary conflicts faced by the gods? How do the gods resolve their disputes with each other? Who says this line? Do not revere your gods. Do not pray to your goddess. And how is this strategy meant to work? Why does this person say this? What kind of relationship does Atrahasis have with Enki? I've already said that he's a devotee of Enki, but there are a lot of different ways that a relationship between a human and a god could go. Look and see how that relationship works. What kind of relationship does Enki have with Enlil, a fellow god? How do the gods feel after the flood? What do we know about Anu, the chief god? What do the sacrifices made by humans do for the gods? In other words, why do humans make sacrifices to gods? Is it just to say, hey, I'm devoted to you? Do the gods actually get something out of it? Watch for that. How do the gods finally resolve the conflict with the human population? And lastly, who is the first to hear the song or the narrative of the flood, according to the narrative itself? And this is going to be right toward the end. Right toward the end, we're going to have some lines of text that tell us a lot about not just what's in that narrative, but how that narrative came down to us. So enjoy your reading, and I'll post another video to watch after you've finished your reading.